At a luxurious wedding, a shabby homeless man sits ignored and judged by everyone around him. When the groom walks up, calls him by name, and reveals he's the man who once saved his life and secretly paid for the wedding, the guests are stunned. In a single moment, the celebration turns into a powerful lesson about gratitude and not judging by appearances. If you ask people what they like about Keanu Reeves, they rarely start with his movies. They talk about the subway videos, the stories of him giving up his seat, staying behind on set to thank the crew, or quietly donating money without putting his name on a plaque. Whether every story is perfectly accurate or not almost doesn't matter. The picture people hold of him is simple. A man who seems to remember that, underneath all the attention, he is just a person among other people. I had that image in mind on a late summer afternoon, standing with a camera slung over my shoulder, waiting for a wedding ceremony to begin. The venue was one of those places that tries to look like the countryside even though it sits only a few minutes from a main road. White chairs lined a small lawn. Fairy lights were strung between young trees that hadn't yet grown into real shade. The air was warm enough that guests fanned themselves with folded programs as they arrived, greeting each other in the small gravel parking lot before walking toward the decorated arch. I was there to film the day for Daniel and Sarah, a couple in their early 30s who wanted, as they'd put it, nothing too dramatic, just something real. As I checked my audio levels and framed wide establishing shots, I noticed someone sitting just outside the main entrance to the lawn. He was on the low stone wall that separated the venue from the overgrown field next to it. Long, dark hair fell around his face and onto the collar of a worn brown jacket. His jeans were faded and stained in places, his boots scuffed down almost flat at the toes. A crumpled paper bag rested on his lap. He sat with the relaxed stillness of someone used to waiting with no particular endpoint in mind. From a distance, if you didn't look too closely, he looked a little like Keanu Reeves, the version you see in candid street photos, dressed in layers, hair loose, half smiling at someone just out of frame. It was an odd echo. A man who carried the outline of a famous face, but none of the protective shine that usually comes with it. Guests noticed him, of course. People notice anyone who doesn't seem to belong where they're standing. A middle-aged man in a navy suit glanced over, then quickly looked back down at his phone. A group of bridesmaids slowed their steps for a second, then walked a little closer together as they passed. One of the ushers, a teenager in a too-big blazer, pretended not to see the man at all, his gaze fixed straight ahead like he'd been told to ignore anything off script. No one said anything openly, but the small adjustments of posture and direction told their own story. People stepped around him the way streams bend around a rock. I heard someone behind me give a quiet, half-laughing comment. "Looks like John Wick's had a rough couple of years," a guest muttered to another, not quite under his breath. They both chuckled, the quick, embarrassed kind of laughter people use when they're not sure what else to do, and moved on. From where I stood, I could see the man clearly enough to catch the details. The slight redness at the edges of his eyes, the visible wear on the cuffs of his jacket, the way his hands rested lightly on the paper bag as if he was careful not to crush it. He didn't look drunk or agitated. He just looked tired, like the day had already given him more than enough before this wedding ever began. He didn't ask anyone for money. He didn't call out. He watched the arrivals the way you might watch a movie playing in a shop window you weren't planning to enter. A woman from the venue staff stepped toward him, wiping her palms on her black apron. She hesitated, then changed course and headed for the bar set up instead. I could almost hear the calculation. Is he really a problem yet? From the corner of my frame, I saw a car pull up, a compact dark sedan decorated with a simple white ribbon. The groom, Daniel, stepped out, followed by his best man. Daniel straightened his tie, hugged his friend, and then turned toward the lawn. For maybe half a second, his eyes shifted to the man on the wall. It wasn't a long look, just a quick searching glance like someone checking whether a promised guest had actually shown up. Then Daniel smiled, small, private, and raised his hand in a brief wave. The man on the wall lifted his chin the slightest bit, a nearly invisible nod. No one around them seemed to notice. The music from the speaker tested its volume. Someone dropped a program, and the bridesmaids started lining up for final photos. A normal wedding day momentum took over. But that small exchange stuck with me. As a videographer, I'm trained to follow moments other people overlook. A hand on a shoulder, a glance across a room, the quiet before a speech. Whatever was happening between Daniel and the man on the wall felt like one of those moments. A little later, as guests found their seats for the ceremony, the venue manager finally decided to act. I saw her walk straight toward the wall, confidence in every step. She leaned forward, speaking firmly but not unkindly. I was too far away to hear the words, but I could guess the script. This is a private event. Could you move along, please? The man listened, his posture shrinking just a little. He nodded in that way people do when they know the conversation was always going to end this way. He started to rise, picking up the paper bag. Before he could stand fully, Daniel crossed the lawn. He left the cluster of groomsmen mid-conversation and walked toward the entrance, his dress shoes kicking up small puffs of dust from the path. Several heads turned to follow him, curious. He reached the venue manager, touched her elbow lightly, and said something. Then he looked past her, straight at the man on the wall. "Mark," he said, loud enough that a few nearby guests heard. "You made it." The way he said the name, without hesitation, without any edge of embarrassment, changed the air around them. The manager stepped back. The man, Mark, paused halfway between sitting and standing, then straightened fully. "Didn't want to crash the fancy party," he replied, voice low but clear. "You're not crashing anything," Daniel said. "You're invited." He opened his arms slightly, an unshowy, ordinary invitation. Mark shifted the paper bag to one hand and accepted the brief hug, patting Daniel's back once, almost formally. It wasn't a dramatic reunion. It looked like what it was, two people who already knew each other, picking up a connection that existed long before the wedding decorations went up. A few guests glanced at each other, puzzled. The man some of them had mentally labeled as the homeless guy at the gate suddenly had a name, a history that intersected with the groom's life. The categories that made things feel simple had blurred. "Can we find him a seat?" Daniel asked the manager, his tone gentle but not optional. "Of course," she replied quickly, her smile a touch tighter than before. "We'll set up a chair at the back." Mark shook his head. "I'm fine standing, don't want to be in the way." "You're not in the way," Daniel said. Then quieter, "Stay where you're comfortable, okay?" Mark nodded. The venue manager retreated, already mentally adjusting her floor plan. Daniel clapped Mark's shoulder once more and returned to his place at the front, where the ceremony was about to begin. By then I was fully curious. Weddings blur together when you film many of them. The same speeches, the same jokes, the same dance songs rotating through different families. But now there was a question sitting at the edge of my frame. Who was Mark to Daniel? When the bride walked down the aisle and the vows were exchanged, Mark stood just outside the main group of chairs, near one of the young trees strung with lights. He didn't try to get closer. He didn't pull out a phone for pictures. He simply watched, hands folded loosely around his paper bag. At one point during the vows, when Sarah's voice caught slightly on the words, "I choose you on the hard days as much as on the easy ones," I saw Mark look down, the barest hint of a smile on his face. He took one small step back into the thin shade of the tree, as if giving the moment extra space. The ceremony ended with applause and the predictable scatter of thrown petals. Guests surged toward the couple with congratulations. I moved through them, catching angles, quick hugs, laughter that would later be layered over music in the edit. Out of habit, I checked my battery, then scanned the edge of the lawn. Mark was still there, standing quietly, mostly unnoticed now that the main spectacle had shifted away from the entrance. A young boy, maybe 6 or 7, wandered near him, chasing a petal caught in the breeze. The petal landed by Mark's boot. The boy, seeing him up close for the first time, froze, uncertain. Mark bent carefully, picked up the petal between rough fingers, and held it out. "Think this belongs back in the party," he said. The boy hesitated, then grinned, took it, and ran back to his parents. A small, ordinary exchange. No one else saw it. Later, when the guests moved inside for the reception and I had a moment between shots, I found Daniel near the bar, sipping water. The formal photos were done, the hardest part of my schedule behind me. I decided to ask. "Hey, Daniel," I said. "Quick question if you don't mind." "Sure," he replied, "as long as it doesn't involve more posing." "Not this time," I smiled. "The man at the entrance, Mark, I saw you greeting him earlier. Should I make sure to get some footage of him with you? Is he someone you'd want included?" Daniel's expression shifted slightly, the surface cheer relaxing into something more thoughtful. "Yeah," he said, "if he's okay with it. He hates cameras, though." He paused, then added, "We met a few years ago. He kind of nudged my life back onto the tracks." There was no dramatic emphasis on the words, just a matter-of-fact honesty. "If you're comfortable sharing," I said, "I'd like to understand. It helps me know what's important." Daniel took another sip of water, looked over my shoulder toward the doorway where the late afternoon light poured in, and began to talk. He told me about a Tuesday night 3 years earlier, in early autumn. At the time, he was working long hours at a small accounting firm, taking on extra projects he didn't really care about. His father had died unexpectedly 6 months before, a loss that still sat like a stone in his chest. His relationship at the time was coming apart under the strain of his numbness. "That night," he said, "I stayed at the office way past the point of being useful. It wasn't that the work needed me. I just didn't feel like going home to an empty flat." By the time he left, most of the city's buses had stopped running frequently. A light rain had started, the kind that doesn't look serious until you realize you're already damp. Daniel, jacket over his arm, walked to the nearest stop, sat down on the plastic bench, and stared at nothing. "I wasn't planning anything drastic," he told me. "I wasn't standing on any bridges. I just felt hollow, like if I faded out of my own life a little more, no one would notice. I figured I'd catch whatever bus came first, maybe ride it until the end of the line, then decide whether to go home or not." He was still sitting there, lost in that gray in-between state, when a man he hadn't seen approach sat down at the other end of the bench. He asked if I minded him sitting, Daniel recalled. Which was funny because it's a public bench, right? But he made it sound like he was asking to share something personal. The man was Mark. He was already living on the streets then, rotating between shelters and places that felt marginally safer than others. He carried a large backpack and a plastic bag with a bottle of cheap coffee from a nearby convenience store. He looked rough, Daniel said. Not dangerous, just worn out, but his eyes were very clear. That's what I remember first. They sat in silence for a while. Then Mark, noticing that Daniel had no umbrella and was letting the rain soak his shirt, unscrewed the lid of his coffee and held it out. "Want a sip?" he'd asked. "It's terrible, but it's warm." Daniel, surprised, almost laughed. He shook his head automatically. "I'm okay," he said. "Thanks." Mark shrugged, took a small drink himself, and squinted at the bus schedule. "You've missed most of the good ones," he remarked. "Last reliable bus was half an hour ago." Daniel checked his watch and realized he'd been staring at the wet pavement longer than he thought. "You waiting on someone?" Mark asked, not pushy, just curious. Daniel hesitated. It was the kind of question that could be brushed off with a joke, but he found himself answering honestly. "Not really," he said. "Just waiting for something to change, I guess." Mark nodded like this made perfect sense. "Yeah," he said, "I know that, wait." They talked in pieces after that. Not a deep confessional, not at first, just small facts exchanged like warm stones. Where Daniel worked, how long Mark had been without a steady place to stay. Mark didn't tell a dramatic story about losing everything in a single bad decision. He described a series of smaller things: an injury, missed shifts, rising rent, a landlord who decided to sell the building that had pushed him steadily to the edge. "No one big villain," he'd said. "Just a lot of little slips and not enough cushion underneath." At some point, Mark looked at Daniel's face more closely. "You look like your mind's still at your desk," he observed. "Or maybe not at your desk, but somewhere that isn't here." Daniel surprised himself by mentioning his father, the unresolved grief. the feeling of moving through his days with a layer of glass between him and everything else. "I didn't cry much at the funeral," he admitted. "Everyone said how well I was holding it together. I think I started believing that was the only acceptable way to be." Mark listened without rushing to respond. When he did speak, his words were simple. "You ever call your mum just to be a mess on the phone?" he asked. Daniel shook his head. His mother lived in another town. Their conversations since the funeral had been brief, scheduled, focused on practical things: paperwork, estate matters, the weather. "Maybe you should," Mark said. "Tonight, before you talk yourself out of it. Grief's heavy enough without carrying it alone because you think you're supposed to be the strong one." There was no sermon in his tone, no, "I've figured out life, let me teach you." It sounded like a man sharing something he'd learned the hard way. "I asked him if he'd done that," Daniel told me. "Called someone and just not held it together." "Yeah," Mark had replied. "Too late sometimes, but yeah." Eventually, the bus arrived. Daniel stood, still unsure where he was going. Mark stayed seated. The stop was his shelter from the rain, not his ticket anywhere. As Daniel stepped onto the bus, Mark called out, "Hey." When Daniel turned, Mark held up a hand, half wave, half warning. "Go home, yeah," he said. "Don't go looking for another empty place to feel empty in." It was such a small sentence, ordinary advice, but something about the way he said it lodged in Daniel's mind. He sat 2 rows behind the driver, took out his phone, and stared at his mother's contact name for a full minute. The bus rolled through half-lit streets. Finally, he pressed call. When she answered, her voice sounded more surprised than anything. He usually texted first. Daniel opened his mouth to deliver the usual, "Just checking in," and instead heard himself say, "Mum, I'm not doing so great." The words cracked something open. He cried, quietly at first, then with more force, trying to keep his voice low in the near-empty bus. His mother, miles away in her kitchen, listened. She didn't have magical solutions. She just stayed on the line, repeating small things. That she was there, that missing his father this much made sense, that being the strong one didn't mean never falling apart. "It was the first honest conversation we'd had since the funeral," Daniel said. "By the time I got home, my shirt was still damp from the rain, but my chest felt lighter. Not fixed, just not sealed shut anymore." The next week, on purpose, he took the late bus again and got off 1 stop early. Mark was there. Daniel bought 2 coffees from the same convenience store and offered one without fuss. "You okay?" Mark had asked. "Not really," Daniel said, "but I made that phone call." Mark lifted his cup in a small toast. "Good start," he replied. Over the following months, Daniel and Mark's paths crossed regularly. Sometimes they sat on that same bench. Sometimes they walked a couple of blocks together before parting ways. The conversation stayed grounded: rent prices, bus routes, small frustrations, small victories. Mark never turned into a project for Daniel to fix. Daniel never turned into a savior with a 5-step plan. But the simple consistency of their contact shifted something in both of them. Daniel started volunteering twice a month at a community kitchen, partly because Mark mentioned it as a place he sometimes ate. There, Daniel met people whose lives had been bent by bad luck, bad health, or bad timing rather than any dramatic moral failure. The neat line he'd drawn between people like me and people on the margins blurred. He saw Mark differently, not as the homeless guy, but as a man who had once been an electrician, who loved old Western films, who could fix a broken outlet faster than most licensed professionals, whose handwriting was surprisingly careful when he filled out forms at the shelter. It was at that community kitchen, a year later, that Daniel met Sarah, who volunteered there with a group from her work. Their relationship grew slowly, over shared tasks and end-of-shift conversations that smelled of dish soap and roast vegetables. "When we got engaged," Daniel told me, "it felt wrong not to invite Mark. He was part of the chain of things that led me here, even if he doesn't like to take any credit." The challenge was practical. Mark didn't have a fixed address. Eventually, through one of the outreach workers, Daniel passed along a simple invitation. "If you want to come, there'll be a chair for you. Come as you are, no pressure." Mark almost didn't. The idea of stepping into a polished wedding with his worn clothes and road-tired face made him uneasy. But in the end, he decided it would be strange not to at least show up at the edge, to see with his own eyes that the young man from the bus stop had made it to this part of his life. That's how he ended up on the low stone wall outside the venue, holding a paper bag with a cheap store-brand sandwich and a bottle of water. He arrived early because that was when the buses ran most reliably. He sat outside because he didn't want to assume he'd be welcome until someone told him directly. Listening to Daniel explain all this, I understood why the moment of him saying Mark's name felt so charged, even though it had lasted only seconds. It wasn't just about preventing a minor social embarrassment at the entrance. It was him publicly confirming, in front of his families and friends and all the carefully arranged decor, that this man belonged in his story. "Do you think he'll mind if I ask for a quick shot of you two together?" I asked. Daniel considered. "Ask him," he said, "and if he says no, just remember him in your own head. Sometimes that's enough." Later, when the reception was underway and the first round of toasts had been given, I found a small window of quiet near the side doors. Mark was there, standing half in and half out of the hall, where he could hear the speeches but not feel trapped by the crowd. The staff had offered him a plate earlier, and he'd accepted enough food to avoid drawing attention. Some chicken, a roll, a few roasted vegetables. Now he held a glass of water, condensation running down onto his fingers. "I'm filming today," I said, introducing myself. "Daniel mentioned you might be okay with a quick shot with him, totally fine if you'd rather not." Mark squinted at me for a second, then chuckled softly. "He told you the bench story?" he asked. "Some of it," I admitted. "He gives me too much credit," Mark said. "I just happened to be sitting there." "Sometimes that's not a small thing," I replied. He looked past me at Daniel across the room, laughing at something a guest had said, his arm around Sarah's shoulders. "Yeah," Mark said quietly. "I'm glad I was there that night." He agreed to the shot as long as it was quick. I signaled to Daniel, who excused himself from his conversation and walked over. They stood side by side near the open doors, no elaborate pose, just two men sharing a frame. "Smile," I said out of habit. They didn't, not really. Their expressions were softer than that, closer to a shared understanding than a grin. I pressed record for a few seconds, capturing the way Daniel's hand rested briefly on Mark's shoulder, the way Mark dipped his head in acknowledgement. A while later, during his main speech, Daniel did something small that I doubt all the guests fully registered. He thanked his and Sarah's families, their friends, everyone who had helped plan the day. He made a gentle joke about how he'd proposed badly but enthusiastically. Then he paused, looking down at his notes for a moment before setting them aside. "There's one more person I want to mention," he said. "Someone most of you don't know." The room quieted almost automatically. "Mark," he continued, glancing toward the side doors, "you're probably wishing I'd keep you invisible right now. I'll be quick, I promise." A few people turned in their chairs to see who he was looking at. Mark, caught between wanting to disappear and wanting to be polite, gave a small half-salute. "3 years ago," Daniel said, "I was sitting at a bus stop trying very hard not to feel anything about losing my dad. Mark shared his terrible coffee with me and told me to call my mum and stop pretending I was fine. He didn't know me. He didn't owe me anything. But he listened and he cared when it would have been easier to just keep staring at the timetable." He shrugged lightly. "I'm not saying he single-handedly turned my life around. That took a lot of people and a lot of time. But he was there at a moment when I needed someone who wasn't already expecting me to be okay. And because of that, I made a phone call I might not have made. That phone call led me back to my family, and eventually, weirdly enough, to the volunteer kitchen where I met Sarah." He lifted his glass. "So, Mark, thank you for the coffee, and for reminding me that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is just notice when someone's not all right and say something simple. I'm very glad you're here." The room didn't erupt into wild applause. People clapped, some more enthusiastically than others, but the mood stayed gentle. A few guests looked thoughtful. One of Sarah's aunts dabbed her eyes with a napkin. The venue manager, leaning against the back wall, seemed to let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Mark shook his head as the attention drifted away, the corners of his mouth twitching in a reluctant smile. When I passed him later, he muttered, half to himself, told him he didn't have to make a fuss. But you could see it mattered. Not the praise, exactly, but the acknowledgement that he existed in the story of this carefully arranged, socially approved happiness. As the evening wore on and the dance floor filled, Mark stayed near the edges. A couple of guests approached to shake his hand or exchange a few words. One older man from Daniel's family ended up in a long conversation with him about old films and the price of electricity in the 70s. No one tried to turn him into a symbol or an object lesson. They simply talked. Before dessert was served, Mark slipped outside. Daniel noticed and followed a minute later. I happened to be by the door, changing lenses, and caught a glimpse of them standing near the same low stone wall where the day had begun. It looked like an ordinary goodbye, no dramatic embraces, no promises that everything would change from here. Daniel pressed something into Mark's hand, a folded card, maybe, or a small envelope. Mark protested briefly. Daniel insisted less than you might expect. In the end, Mark tucked it into his jacket without looking at it. "You sure you don't want a taxi?" Daniel asked. "I've got my roots," Mark replied. "And anyway, I've seen enough dancing for one night." They both laughed, soft and easy. "Take care of her," Mark added, nodding toward the venue where Sarah's silhouette moved near the window. "I will," Daniel said. They hugged once, awkward and genuine, and then Mark walked toward the bus stop down the road, his figure slowly blending into the deepening blue of the evening. Daniel watched until he disappeared around the corner, then turned back toward the music and light. When I got home after packing up, I backed up the footage as I always do. Clips from the day filled the screen. Vows, laughter, a grandmother's careful steps onto the dance floor. Among them, almost lost, was the 10-second shot of Daniel and Mark by the open doors. I watched it again before turning off the monitor. Two men standing side by side, neither dressed quite like the other, both carrying history the camera couldn't see. No soundtrack, no slow motion, just the hum of room noise and the clink of cutlery in the background. It made me think again of the stories people tell about Keanu Reeves, the small acts of consideration that travel so easily online because they confirm something hopeful we want to believe about human nature. We like the idea that someone who could demand special treatment chooses not to. That behind the famous name is a person who remembers to hold doors, to listen, to share a quiet moment with a stranger. But watching Daniel and Mark, I was reminded that the same kind of gentleness and attention exists all around us in people whose names most of us will never learn. A man sharing terrible convenience store coffee with someone on a rainy night. A groom insisting that his friend from the bus stop belongs just as much at his wedding as the cousin who flew in from overseas. A guest choosing, after a short speech, to see the homeless guy at the gate as Mark instead. Everyone avoided him at first because of how he looked, because of the assumptions that kept the day neat and comfortable. It took one person saying his name out loud in front of everyone to shift the story. Not from villain to hero, but from object to human being. In the end, what stayed with me wasn't any single dramatic gesture. It was a collection of small, almost invisible choices. Mark noticing Daniel's quiet distress years before. Daniel remembering that moment when planning his wedding. The simple decision to acknowledge publicly that he hadn't gotten from that bus stop to the altar entirely by himself. We live in a world where famous kindness travels fast, wrapped in headlines and shared clips. There's nothing wrong with that. Those stories can remind us of who we'd like to be. But most of the real, sustaining kindness that holds people up never sees a camera. It happens at bus stops and in shelter kitchens, in quick conversations and awkward hugs outside reception halls. If there's a lesson in that afternoon, it isn't about feeling guilty for the times we've looked away. It's softer than that. It's an invitation to notice a little more, to see the people at the edges of our carefully planned moments, to understand that they too carry histories, losses, and quiet strengths. To remember that saying someone's name, treating them as part of the shared human story, can be a form of kindness all by itself. Keanu Reeves will probably keep being a symbol for many people of humility in the spotlight. But somewhere tonight and every night, there are countless marks sitting on benches, sharing bad coffee, asking simple questions at just the right time. Their faces aren't famous. Their actions won't trend. And yet in the lives of the people they touch, their kindness is just as real, just as important, just as worthy of being remembered.